I'm thrilled to be hosting this event with Albert. I know that Albert doesn't like long introductions, so I'm not going to make a very long introduction. But Albert is is a really successful venture capitalist. He has made some phenomenal investments, lots of names that you'd have heard of: Etsy, MongoDB, Twilio. Before that, he was an entrepreneur. But Albert is also an academic. He's a true academic. He thinks in the way that sort of deep thinking academics think, which is why I'm saving his greatest accomplishment for last, which is that he teaches a course at NYU Stern.
With Arun.
We co-teach a course called Customer-Centric Digital Entrepreneurship, or Tech in the City, depending on who you believe. But when you see Albert in the classroom, you see that academic in him coming out. And you see that sort of that deep, sort of incisive thinking that is characteristic of Albert in his book as well. So welcome, Albert. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting this. I'm excited for this.
So let's dive right in. I figured since we're at a university, we could be a little linear at first and actually dive into what the book is about and your arguments, because it's a relatively short book, but it's sort of chock full of thinking and of sort of concepts that can be sort of brought to life. But before we get there, I mean, why did you end up writing a book? I mean, what's the journey that led to this book emerging?
So I sort of feel like there was this set of coincidences that put me in this position. I fell in love with computers very early as a teenager in Germany. And then I somehow also wound up studying economics, both of them, both as an undergrad and as a graduate. And then through some other lucky circumstances, I wound up being in venture capital. And I sort of felt like, wow, I have this kind of front row seat to the future, like all these companies that are up and coming. And it got clearer and clearer to me that somehow a lot of people were still very confused about digital technology.
Okay.
And that they somehow didn't understand that it was so extraordinary. And I'm like, I need to explain why it's so extraordinary and how that's really going to change everything.
Okay. And you wrote this book sort of gradually over time, right? I remember
like 6 or 7 years, yeah.
There was a point where it was just sort of coming together on a website. And
yeah, I used actually GitHub, so you can, I checked in the revisions into GitHub, so you can see kind of how I changed my thinking on certain things and rearranged parts of the book. And I liked that process because I got a lot of feedback and it kind of challenged some of my thinking. And I'm planning to write another book, and I'm planning to write it in the same process because...
Yeah, I wish we had a GitHub for politicians, right?
Or podcasters, honestly. I mean, because they just say one thing one week, and then 3 months later, the opposite, and nobody really follows.
Okay, well, maybe there's a company out there for one of you to start. So, I know that one of the initial sort of assertions of the book and a premise of, I think, a lot of your thinking and your investments sort of over time is that digital is fundamentally different, and the changes that are going to be caused by digital are far more profound than most people realize. And so why don't we start there? I mean, tell us why you think digital is different and why its changes will be so profound.
So, I think the fundamental category error that's being made is that people are like, well, computers are machines, and we've had machines before, so there's nothing new here to see. But computers, even though they're machines, have two properties that are foundationally different from the machines that came before them. And those are zero marginal cost and universality of computation. So zero marginal cost basically means that if you are in the back and bored and you're going to watch a YouTube video instead, like that extra video view on YouTube essentially has no perceptible cost of any kind. YouTube servers are already running, your network connection is already fired up, your phone is already running, and so forth. And so this idea that you can make digital copies on the margin for free, that doesn't exist anywhere in the physical world. Like if you want an extra chair, if there's not one available, like that takes a lot of energy, that takes a lot of logistics, that takes a lot of material, and so forth. And so the physical world is full of marginal cost, and much of our thinking in economics, microeconomics, business, and so forth is premised on marginal cost being significantly above zero. So that's the first part. And then the second part is this universality of computation. When you go in your kitchen in the morning, you use your toaster to make toast and your coffee machine to make coffee. Don't ever try to make coffee with your toaster. It will short circuit the toaster, I guarantee. And similarly, you can't make a toast with your coffee machine. Well, I haven't tried that one, so I don't know. Maybe you'll be more successful with that. But
it sort of put the dough at the bottom.
Yeah, maybe somehow. But the point is, a computer will do one thing 1 minute, and then a totally different thing another minute, just by changing out the software. And it can compute pretty much anything that can be computed. And lots of things that we do are fundamentally computations. We take some inputs, we run some sequence of things, and we provide an output. And then, of course, so that's completely different. Like, if you go into a traditional machine shop, a drill can drill, but it can't do other things, right? So we didn't have these kind of machines ever before, and it's really foundational different, and you can combine those two things too. So you have universality of computation with zero marginal cost. So for example, if we build a system that can provide diagnoses, the inputs are what are the symptoms, the outputs is a differential diagnosis, the marginal diagnosis will be free. And that's just an extraordinary state of the world that we just didn't have. And it's not at all comparable to anything that came before.
Yeah, I know, it's fascinating, right? Because they're programmable in this modular way, and then the cost of computing keeps dropping, and so they end up doing more and more things, right? And then more and more of the world becomes this zero marginal cost world, right? But then, in many ways, from that premise, the book starts to get deeper into human history, right? Because you're making this bold assertion that we are in this fourth phase of, you talk about these three different phases of different kinds of scarcity, or three ages which were defined by different things being scarce. And now we're in this fourth phase. And so just take us through that, because I've heard you do it in our class, and I've seen the expression on the students' faces when you do. So I want to give this the same experience.
So Homo sapiens emerged roughly 250,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And then for the longest time, we were hunter-gatherers. Foragers. In that age, the scarcity was food. Your tribe either found enough food, or you starved, or you migrated. And then only about 10,000 years ago, so relatively short by comparison, we had this series of interlocking inventions that together we call agriculture. So it's like figuring out that you can domesticate animals, figuring out that you can put seeds in the ground, that you can irrigate them, that you can store them, and so forth. And that completely shifted the scarcity. The scarcity went from food directly to land. And if you had enough arable land, so arable meaning you could grow things on it, you could have a kind of thriving civilization. And if you didn't, you tended to crumble quite quickly. And there's many examples of this. Of course, like if you go to the Yucatan, if you've ever vacationed there, you see what was a very flourishing culture, small shift in climate, and the whole thing just fell apart, right? So that was the new constraint. The new constraint was arable land, and if you had it, you could have these sort of very different societies. And then only a couple hundred years ago, we had the Enlightenment, and we figured out a lot of science, and we figured out how to generate power, steam power, electric power, how to do chemistry, how to do mining, and so forth. And the constraint shifted again. It shifted from land to capital. And when I use the word capital throughout the book, and for the most part throughout tonight, I mean physical capital. So that's machines and buildings and roads and railroads and so forth. If you could crank those out, you could have a flourishing industrial society. And if you couldn't, you were struggling. And the reason the book is called The World After Capital is because I'm making the argument that we actually have now sufficient physical capital, but that we have a new scarcity. And part of the idea here is that what technology does is it kind of shifts the space of what's possible. And when you have a big technological breakthrough, the space of the possible becomes much, much larger. And for people who are into like optimization problems, generally when you release a constraint, like all of a sudden a new binding constraint emerges. So you can think of this as being a series of transitions where we suddenly figure out how to get beyond a constraint and a new constraint emerges. So you get beyond the constraint of the amount of immediately available food, the new constraint becomes land. You get beyond the constraint of land, all of a sudden the constraint becomes capital. You get beyond the constraint of capital, well, we'll talk about it in a second, what happens. But the thing that's important to keep in mind is that these were not small incremental transitions. These were extremely profound transitions, and each time we pretty much changed everything about how we live. And so if you construe digital technology as just a continuation of industrial machines, you'll be like, our job here together as entrepreneurs, policymakers, citizens is to maintain the industrial age. But if you conceive of them as radically changing the space of the possible, then our collective job is not to keep us in the industrial age, but to invent a new age that comes after it.
And each of these transitions wasn't sudden, right? I mean, it took place over years, decades, maybe even centuries, right?
Yeah, they weren't sudden in the terms of like being from like one day to the next, but they were quite sharp transitions in relative to the length of history, right? So, for example, when agriculture emerged, the agrarian societies kind of wiped out the foraging societies quite rapidly. So that wasn't like another 10,000 years, that was like a couple hundred years at most.
Okay.
And then when we went from the agrarian age to the industrial age, that was maybe, I think you could sort of say that transition began kind of in the 1800s, and it concluded with World War II.
Yep.
But both of these transitions, I think it's important to point out, were really brutal, right? I mean, we literally wiped out the foraging societies, and then we didn't get into the industrial age until we had 2 world wars and multiple revolutions, and then failed experiments like communism killing tens of millions of people. So these were very violent transitions. And one of the reasons and one of the motivations for writing the book is because we have this history and we should be learning from it and we should be making new mistakes, not repeating the old ones.
So we're sort of in this new transition, right? Or we're still in the era of capital to some extent, but we're entering the era of scarcity, a new kind of scarcity. And so can you tell us a bit more about that? I mean, because it's interesting, because I never, until I read the book, I never really framed things this way, that capital is sufficient, but there is something else that isn't.
So for better or worse, one of the things I do in the book is I redefine a lot of terms. So I use the word scarcity not in the economic sense of a positive price, but in the sense of if you don't have enough of this thing, really, really bad things happen to you. Like if you didn't find enough food as a foraging type, bad things happened. If you didn't have enough land as an agrarian society, really bad things. If you didn't have enough capital, bad things happen in the industrial age. And so sufficiency means that it's not the thing that's holding you back. And I believe capital is sufficient. I spent a lot of time and a lot of data in the book on building the case for that. The thing that's scarce now is attention. What is attention? Attention is basically what you have put your mind to, either individually or collectively as society, what you've sort of focused on for some time period. So it's to time the way that velocity is to speed. It's like speed just tells you how fast you're going, velocity tells you where you're going. Time is just how much time you've spent. Attention is what you've spent that time on.
I like the way you put it. You say it's time and intentionality.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And it's the example I give is when you walk into the exam room, you can't go, oh man, I should have studied a lot more in the last 3 weeks. It's like whatever amount of studying you did, that's the amount of studying you're going to get. And when you get a new virus emerging in the world, you can't be like, oh, we should have done more research on that, And it's crazy because we had SARS 20 years ago, which is a coronavirus. Then we had MERS 10 years ago, which was a coronavirus. And then we literally shut down those research programs. And so that is an example of not paying enough attention to something that was very clear that we should be paying attention to. And it was not a constraint of capital. It's not, we didn't have enough machines to do the research or we didn't have enough labs to do the research. No, we just didn't focus on doing the research.
And so, if you think about the scarcity of attention, once you frame it that way, it makes sense. There are, every human being has 24 hours. With the current technology, it's hard to pay attention to more than one thing, or hard to spend that time on multiple things in parallel. There may be sort of cloning technology that comes in the distant future that breaks this constraint. But you also say another intriguing thing, which is that, in thinking about the way in which attention is allocated, you talk about how price fails as an attention allocation mechanism. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think, as you said in the introduction, I'm a venture capital investor. I love markets and I love the price mechanism. When it is available, is amazing. It's amazing at aggregating information in ways that central planning cannot do and has failed to do. And because markets have been so successful at the formation of capital, if you continue to think about the world's problem as a capital problem, you'll be like, well, everything should be a market, everything can be solved through markets.
Yeah.
Attention, however, is very, very different, because the most important things that we could be or should be paying attention to do not have prices, and more importantly, cannot have prices, because there are no markets for them. So I want to just give two examples. At the individual level, there is no supply and demand for how much attention you give to the question of what is your purpose in life, where do you get meaning from in life, That's for you, like you're either going to allocate attention to it or you won't. But there's no price signal. The only price signals you're getting for your time are things like labor, like you get paid for your time, or you get all these things vying for your attention where other people have paid to get some sliver of your attention. Right, so the price mechanisms actually are working to allocate your attention towards priced things, and you finding purpose in life, you finding meaning in life is not a price thing and cannot be a price thing, because there's no supply and demand for it. It's one of the reasons why people vastly underallocate attention to this. It explains things like midlife crises, explains lots of other crises, mental health crises, because people are like, I don't know what it all means, I don't have any purpose. And we've had some historic answers. Religion has provided powerful answers to that. A lot of people aren't religious anymore, so they actually would need to actively work on finding a substitute, but they don't, and as a result, they experience these crises. And then we have these collective attention problems. So every few million years, some really big debris from space hits Earth. It has very bad implications. And there's no market for this. The people who may be impacted by this may not have been born yet. But again, like when that thing shows up, whatever technology we have is the technology we're going to have. So we have to put the attention into detecting and deflecting today. And we're just, relative to the scale of that particular problem when it occurs, we're vastly underallocating resources, because we're kind of sort of relying on the market to take care of these things. And I can list any number of other problems that have similar characteristics, that it's either happens very, very rarely, or it kind of has long tail outcomes. So like people talk a lot about climate and pricing out the climate crisis. I'm like, this includes a whole bunch of tail risk that's really, really bad, and there's no amount of pricing that will ever get at understanding what that tail risk is.
Yeah, and there also seems to be a pattern of sort of differing levels of distance into the future, that where you're not the entity bearing the consequences of today's attention.
Or at least you don't think so.
You don't think so. Yeah. Well, I think we've been proven wrong recently, yes. And we will continue to be proved wrong again. But so if you think about where we are now, so we've gone from sort of food scarcity to land scarcity to capital scarcity, and we're now entering attention scarcity. And you're anticipating this massive upheaval of everything. Like, I'll collectively call those things institutions. I realize it's sort of broader than that, but the world's institutions have to change. And you then go on to sort of identify, it's a good book because you're not just saying, here's the problem. You're also laying out, here are the objectives that we should be optimizing to solve. And then you later get on to here's the solution. But, you bring up these 3 freedoms that you feel are important to attain in whatever new world is designed around these, designed in this 4th era. And, they're, and I'm sort of reciting the book now, so I may be causing your sales to drop a little. But we're trying to sort of draw people's attention to the ideas, and the price mechanism may not be the best way to do this, right? So,
especially because you can get the book for free online.
Exactly,
so.
Right? See, that's one of the things I love about this book, right? I mean, the ethos or the philosophy that you expound in the book. Has been followed in the creation of the book, right?
And in its distribution, yeah.
The information has been free. So the 3 freedoms are economic, information, and psychological. And I want to start with, sort of psychological freedom, because it's an unusual one. And I'll just say one more thing and then hand it over to you, because many of the students in the class that we teach together are trying to learn about how do you become a successful VC from Albert. And they're kind of looking at me saying, what is this guy doing in the class? I mean, what? But yeah, they have a couple of things to learn from me as well. And
they do.
And many of the years, Albert has talked to them about how a mindfulness practice is a really important determinant of success in general, but success as a VC investor. And there's always sort of surprise on people's faces. This is not what they were expecting. And so, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on that. I mean, how do you think about mindfulness, and why are you drawing our attention to its importance?
Well, let me start in a slightly different corner and then get there in a second. So the reason I'm writing about freedoms at all is twofold. One, I think the cardinal problem that we face is freeing up attention. How do we take attention that's currently trapped elsewhere and free it up?
Okay.
And to what end? Well, to the end of creating more knowledge, right? And that could be more self-knowledge, like understanding your purpose. It could be more collective knowledge, like how to deflect asteroids or how to solve the climate crisis. And so mindfulness is a great starting point, because each one of us can get going with that individually today, like later tonight, if you don't already have a mindfulness practice. And it is so important and so powerful exactly because our brains are so maladapted to the current environment that we're in. Just like our bodies crave sugar, and so if you add high fructose corn syrup to everything, you will sell a lot more bad snacks. Our brains love these little information hits, right? Because sort of in the ancestral environment, when you saw a cat, that was an actual cat. Now the internet can produce an infinity of cat pictures for you, right? So you have to have some way of being like, okay, I enjoy cat pictures, so I'm going to go watch some cat pictures, and then I'm going to stop watching cat pictures. And that is an act of asserting your own sort of mental independence. And the only way you can do that, I believe, is through having some kind of mindfulness practice. I mean, there are technological hacks. You can set your phone so that it stops after a certain time, and then you can immediately hit, I want more time. That's how they configure these things, so not all that helpful. But I have my phone set to do not disturb at all times, for example. Nothing makes this phone vibrate other than an immediate family member calling or texting. So there are some hacks, but at the heart of it, I believe you have some mindfulness practice. Now, why does it relate to investing? Because investing is deeply psychological, right? And so why do so many people lose money in the stock market? Because they buy high and sell low. Why do they buy high and sell low? It's because they get FOMO, the AI trend, I've got to pile into NVIDIA now, By the way, don't take any of this as investing advice. And then, so then they're late, and then inevitably things correct, and then they're like, oh, I'm losing money, and then they're like, but maybe it'll go back up, and so then they wait too long because they sort of have regrets, and then they sell at the bottom, and so, and the same is true for venture capital. You get these FOMO waves, and everybody's like, got to be in a delivery startup. Like it doesn't matter whether we think the unit economics work or not. And so a lot of being successful as an investor is being able to have some more control over your mental state.
And what kind of practice do?
I tried a lot of different things. I tried running. I had bad knees, didn't work, and I'm heavy. I tried yoga. I'm not very flexible. I tried meditation. Couldn't make it work. So I do conscious breathing. So I do conscious breathing exercises, and I do them every morning first thing, and every evening almost nearly last thing I do. And that works for me. That may not work for you. Like, I think this is a very deeply personal thing, and everybody has to find a practice that works for them. But that such practices exist that I know, and that's not new knowledge, that is ancient knowledge, right? I mean, Buddhist practice, the Stoics, like you can look at Western and Eastern, and they all have this idea that, and then the beautiful thing is with modern medicine, we actually understand why these things work and how they work. We're beginning to really unravel that, but they totally work.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that there's such a tremendous improvement in sort of so many aspects of one's life that come from just recognizing that mindfulness is important, but also sort of finding what works for you. I mean, I think that that's sort of really important, not trying to chase down something that someone has told you to do specifically. So I'm really glad you're saying that. Now, let's move to a topic where we may not agree completely with each other, and that has to do with the path to economic freedom. And so in the book and in other forums, I know you believe in that the right path to economic freedom is some sort of universal basic income, which I guess sets a floor in some way for people to be able to, take care of certain needs. And so it's redistributive from some set of entities to sort of other human beings. So why do you see this rather than some other mechanism of setting that floor as the right path for the future?
There's a couple of different reasons. The first is that I think it's the least distortive thing that we can do.
Can you tell us what?
Well, least distortive compared to, let's say, why do we feel compelled that we need a minimum wage? We feel compelled because we're realizing that there's such an asymmetry between the power of employers and employees that in the absence of a minimum wage, people will be forced to work for things that just don't add up. You have large employers that on the first day of employment tell people, and here's how you apply for benefits from the government so that you can actually work for us for this not enough money. So I think certain other things are distortive. I think the government providing a lot of services is very distortive because I don't think the government is very good at providing services in many instances. And that has to do with not bad intentions, that has to do with incentives and the evolution of bureaucracy over time. So even systems that set out and are quite good initially often have a hard time remaining good over longer time horizons. And I believe there's an interesting intellectual tradition to this idea of basic income. So in the US, when people arrived here early on, they got land. Now, a very important historic footnote, land that used to belong to other people, native tribes, but people got land, and there was a strong sense of how this provided freedom. The idea was you could be a subsistence farmer, and you could be totally free. Yeah. And this was an important conception of the political process because the idea was, and this is in a lot of writing in the early thinking of American state formation, that free people coming together freely makes for a different form of government, a government by the people, for the people. Yeah. And so one of the more extraordinary turns of event is that back then, all the way back then, when very little of what we know as the US today was had people living in it, Thomas Paine and some others were like, we're going to run out of land eventually. So they were really looking far forward and like, and how are people going to be free once we run out of land? And all the way back then, there were some early ideas, some early writing where we're like, well, we could just give people money. And if they had money, and just sort of enough money to get by, they would still be very free. Very different from, think of the person today who's working 2 or 3 low-paying jobs that are all being scheduled by machines. The machines don't care about whether they actually should be taking care of their child or wanted to go on a date that evening. This is why I'm calling it economic freedom. It's a freedom, a much more fundamental freedom about how you want to allocate your attention.
Okay, but why is it that you think that this freedom, that the path to this economic freedom is through money? Because in the example you gave earlier...
Well, what else are you going to give people?
that is true. I guess if land is no longer scarce, you can't give them land. If capital is no longer scarce, but you always wonder about whether, and I'm not going to spend the rest of the session debating this with you because chances are that you've thought about this much more deeply than I have, clearly. But there is a belief that part of the value of government is in creating the public goods, collecting the money and creating the public
Sure.
goods so that society can grow. And so if we have a choice between, sort of reallocating through a UBI or investing in public goods, isn't there an argument also for the former?
Yeah. No, so I am very much not a libertarian at all. I very much believe in the role of government, and there are examples of the type of regulation that I believe government should be providing in the book. I also believe in the provision of public goods. I do think that provision of public goods should, as much as possible, happen at the lowest possible level.
The most local.
Ideally, fairly local, yeah. And again, because I do think that it's very easy for government to get too big.
Yeah.
That's by far the failure mode. And there's an incredible book by Joseph Tainter. I'm butchering his last name. It's called The Collapse of Complex Civilizations. And he's an archaeologist. It's a very slender book and highly recommend reading it. And basically he traces example through many different civilizations of kind of the bureaucratic apparatus kind of getting ever bigger and having essentially diminishing returns and calcifying. And I just think there's very little evidence that this process can be stopped. And so I think you want to have people empowered to form communities and to take care of as many problems as possible within the communities and provide public goods within their communities, like a park, a community deciding locally that it should have a park and then being bought into maintaining that park for its own community.
Okay.
And I think we have erred on, we're in a weird state where for some problems we've erred on giving them too far to sort of national government. And then we have some other problems where we actually would kind of need a global consensus and we don't have a mechanism for that. So like the climate crisis, we would actually need a more global consensus and we don't have a mechanism. So I think a lot of problems are being handled at the wrong level. Basically.
Yeah, we've sort of got this middle ground that isn't working for a lot of things and we need one of the extremes. So I'll touch on 2 more topics and then let's sort of throw it open. One you don't. The last topic, just to sort of key it up, will be about AI because it's sort of the topic of the day. But I have noticed in your reading, in reading your book, and also sort of in interacting with you, that there's sort of this thread of humanism that permeates the ideas that you express and sort of in some ways the underlying philosophy. Is that would that be an accurate characterization?
Absolutely, and I have a whole chapter on humanism, and the ideas I'm gathering for the second book are very much an extension. I think the book will be entirely about humanism. I sort of think that if you want to increase freedoms, which I'm very much in favor for, you also need to have some values that kind of hold people together, right? Because otherwise, I think chaos ensues, not in a constructive way. So then the question becomes, where do those values come from? And historically, we've relied on religion in most parts of the world to be the source of values. And I don't think religion is a great source going forward, because then you have these conflicts. Well, my religion says this and your religion says this, and like they're incompatible. And so there's some work here, and a lot of work I've been doing subsequently, and that really be in the next book, of how can you arrive at some set of values that could be quite universal. And that's a very bold claim in a time when so much is about, oh, well, your lived experience is different from my lived experience, so nothing you can say can possibly be relevant to me, which I think is a huge mistake. I think we need almost the exact opposite. We need to form some understanding of a very small core set of values that we do believe to be hold true for humanity as a whole.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, and I guess sort of the final point before we throw it open to the audience, and you'll notice that I have completely avoided discussions about venture capital, discussions about entrepreneurship. If you're thinking about questions, don't, how do I come up with, what's the next big thing to invest in is not the question that we're hoping for. But in many ways, I can think of my final question as, you could phrase it as how do we ensure that increasingly powerful AI is sort of imbued with sufficient humanism. But I guess I'm curious about your point of view, because I actually never talked about this with you before, on the fears that people are starting to express about the possibility of increasingly powerful artificial intelligence posing an existential threat to humanity in the long run. And so you've got, in one camp, you've got people like colleagues in my philosophy department that say, well, we're not worried about gaming systems wiping us out, but they have many of the same capabilities that AI does, so it's really a labeling problem. If we had called this sort of nonlinear optimization instead of artificial intelligence, nobody would be worried. Then you've got other people like Jan Tallinn, who sort of makes this argument that it won't be intentional wiping out of humanity. It'll be the way humanity has wiped out so many other species. It's just sort of a byproduct of wanting to progress. Maybe the AIs will want easier interplanetary travel, and sort of the atmosphere will be something that comes in the way. So where do you fall on this? I mean, what's your thinking here?
I very much believe that the existential risk is real, and I think it cannot be dismissed. And I think people like Mark Andreessen basically going out there and saying everybody who talks about existential risk is just a crank, or is just trying to make money, or is a shill, I just think is the least intellectually honest thing ever. I think we have a long history that shows that when something that's somewhat more intelligent comes along, it displaces, and often in very brutal ways. I gave the example, the agrarian societies were a bit more intelligent because basically they started to have books and weapons and other things, and they wiped out the foraging societies. And history is full of some slightly more advanced civilization arriving somewhere and more or less wiping out the indigenous population. And I don't see how you can look at that and go, yeah, it'll all be fine. I mean, I don't know. Has anybody read The Three-Body Problem? If you haven't, you should absolutely read it. That's fantastic. Six and Liu. I think it's pretty clear that the right way to think about what we're potentially creating is not even another digital machine, but is like an alien intelligence. And so I think these concerns are warranted. Now, I'm also not sleeping. I mean, Jan and some other people are like, we got to party and also not sleep because they're really worried that it's imminent. If you read Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence, which he published quite a long time ago, there are these sort of accelerated escape scenarios and so forth. personally, I don't think they're impossible. I just think there's sort of low likelihood at this particular moment in time, but not zero likelihood. But I think it's very important, and I have some ideas of what to do about it too, as it turns out.
Okay, well, maybe.
So we can maybe get to that.
Yeah, maybe that'll be.
But yes, I think it's very real, and it should absolutely not be dismissed.
Okay, wonderful. So, on that cheery, optimistic note, we're going to open it up for questions. We've got people with microphones, and so just sort of raise your hand. I'm going to stand up and take a picture of you guys because you're such a good-looking audience, and you know, I don't want to lose this chance. So while I'm doing that, are there any initial questions? In the back there, yeah. I wish I had my new iPhone. Better picture.
Hi, I'm Julia Moss, Stern student here. I have a lot of questions. I've been trying to compound to one.
Let's have one. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about the golden rule, because you're talking about religion and how that might play out, and also what I've called augmented intelligence and policy?
Well, I don't actually talk about the golden rule in the book, but I do talk about solidarity, and to me that's a very related concept. So I think one of the sort of motivators, so to take a brief side tour for a moment, who's read Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*? All right, great. It's a terrible book. And the reason it's a terrible book is...
Albert, this is being recorded.
Yes, it is a terrible book. And the reason it's a terrible book is because he sort of says, well, all narratives are equally valid. And this is sort of a hyper-relativist position. First of all, I think that would sort of suggest that, you know, ISIS chopping people's heads off is an equally valid narrative, and I just think that's a bad starting point. But I also think that there is an objective fact that we can point to that makes humans different. And that is we have knowledge. We have books. I can pick up a book today that somebody else wrote 1,000 years ago in another part of the world. Like no other species on this planet has that. And it is knowledge that is the source of our great power. It is also, as this font of philosophical wisdom Spider-Man suggests, it's also why we are responsible. With great power comes great responsibility. Like, we're responsible for the whales, not the whales for us. Why? Because we have books and the whales don't have books.
That we know of, I mean, you know.
And so there is an objective basis for humanism. And so this idea that all narratives are equally valid, I think, is just factually wrong because there are factual differences. And I don't need to appeal to some nebulous concept like consciousness because for all I know, whales have consciousness. For all I know, my dog has consciousness. I don't even know whether you have consciousness or I have consciousness or what it even means. But like the existence of knowledge is an objective fact of reality. And so I think it provides an objective basis for humanism. And to come back to your question, it's why we should be showing solidarity to other humans. Because we are so much more alike than we're different. And you have to start with the solidarity before you can celebrate the differences. Once we have established solidarity, we can celebrate our differences. But if we don't take this first step, then our differences just become divisive. And then there was a second part of the question that I've totally blanked on. So.
Well, we can move on to the next, the gentleman in the front here. Yeah. And, you know,
just ask and I'll repeat it.
So I'm Scott Corwin. I'm a Stern alum. I'm also at Deloitte, and I lead everything we do in sustainability and climate change. I'm curious, with the world after capital, and maybe you get into this in the book, look, we're at a moment in time where literally every economic system is about to be massively transformed to move to a low-carbon, clean energy future. And it may take decades, but we're in this sort of race against time. And so the cycles of time are now pressing in on us in a way that no other transition quite is sort of gated or... So how do you think about that? And what does that future world begin to look like in terms of, if it's a world after capital, what's the next world that we're living with all of these enormous challenges? But this one is a planetary, wide set of challenges.
So I actually do spend some time talking about the climate crisis in the book, and you know, we're spending at the moment, depending on which economy, somewhere between maybe 3 to up to 5% of GDP on trying to achieve this transformation to a low carbon economy. And I believe that's off by an order of magnitude. So I think we're very far behind. I'm on record, and I'll be on record again, saying I believe we need to get to a wartime deployment. So at the height of World War II, the US was using roughly 50% of GDP on the war effort. And I believe we need to get into that ballpark for sustained, meaning 5 to 10 years, to get on top of this problem. I think people still have no concept of how terrifying this problem truly is. We're going to run a quick life experiment here. Okay, so you all know what greenhouse gases are, right? So remember how I talked about the different ages? So 10,000 years of agrarian age, the CO2 level and the methane level in the atmosphere were roughly constant. Okay, we call that the pre-industrial baseline. Since then, we've emitted a lot of CO2 and also a bunch of methane, and so we're trapping heat that used to go into space, that no longer goes in space, it stays down here and heats up the planet. And so the right unit for understanding heat is joule. Nobody knows what a joule or a petajoule is. So we're going to use Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs. All right? So I want everybody to put the hand up now. All right? Just put your hands up. Everybody put the hand up. Okay, I'm going to say some number, and then when you think that's the number, you take your hand down. So do you think the amount of heat that used to go into space that now stays down here on Earth, do you think it's 1 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bomb per year? Do you think it's 1 per month? Do you think it's 1 per week? Do you think it's 1 per day? Do you think it's 1 per hour? Do you think it's 1 per minute? All right, there are a few hands still up. It is 4 per second.
Wow.
Every second of every minute, of every hour, of every day, we're trapping 4 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs worth of heat here that used to go into space. Okay, now I want you to have a different picture in your head. I want you to picture alien spaceships hovering above Earth, dropping 4 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs into our atmosphere every second. What would we do? We would drop everything. We've made a great movie about it with Will Smith, Independence Day. Sequel was not quite as good. But we would activate every resource we have. And this is the level of the challenge. And if you follow the numbers, 23, the numbers are horrifying. Everything is off the charts. Like the ocean temperature, it was 100-degree water off Miami. But the whole North Atlantic is way hotter than it's ever been. Greenland is melting way faster. Antarctic ice is melting way faster. The methane level in the atmosphere is rising way faster. There are all these tipping points. And so this is an attention problem. It's not actually a problem of how much capital we have. In the book, I give the example of World War II production of airplanes. So cars, there's a chart in the book that shows cars in the United States taking off in the early 1900s. And then there's a huge drop in car production that coincides with World War II. Why this drop in car production? Because the government went to General Motors and said, we don't want you building cars, we want you building tanks. And they went to Ford and said, we don't want you building cars, we want you building airplanes. And on the one hand, this number that I've just given you is totally shocking. And you're like, how is this possible? But we could still actually succeed in this if we get to this level of activation. And this is an attention problem. Ford built a plant, it was called the Willow Run plant. The Willow Run plant built the B-17 Liberator bomber. Now, if you go to a museum down in DC or in New Orleans and you see a B-17, it's a big airplane. It has 4 engines, has lots of gun turrets, and a Norden bomb sight. An incredibly complex piece of machinery. And at peak war production, the Willow Run plant finished one of these airplanes every hour. That is the kind of thing that becomes possible when you allocate 50% of GDP to the effort. That is where I believe we need to get because we're so far behind. Unfortunately, attention on this problem isn't properly priced and can't be priced because the outcomes that are so bad, there's no market mechanism to even cover how bad these outcomes are. There's nothing that will Price somehow killing off 1 billion or 2 billion people, which is the trajectory we're on. Like, I'm an optimist. I really think we can still solve this, but I also believe that we're on course to kill 1 billion or 2 billion people because we're not going to be able to maintain our food supply chain at all. And so, unfortunately, I just think it's going to get a lot worse before we get to that level of conviction. And in the meantime, investors and entrepreneurs should be creating as many possible solutions that government can finally get behind when government finally gets conviction. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but I think it's probably one of the most important questions to be thinking about at the moment.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, and you've partly answered my question. It wasn't one that I expected to ask. Your talk has been very interesting, and it's gone in a direction I didn't expect. I've always felt as a people over the long arc of history, our sort of level of consciousness has increased, and we've been able to solve amazing things. It's easy to be pessimistic now, where I think we see ego overriding so many things and not being able to have people come together, whether they be politicians, business people, solve these serious problems. I'm almost hearing in what you're saying, it may well take some extraordinary crisis before that happens. You mentioned you're an optimist. I'd like to be an optimist as well. But I really think there are the potential for an existential crisis.
Oh no,
and that's what will it need a crisis? I mean, AI, the climate?
Yes, I mean, I think that I'm very optimistic about where we can ultimately get to. I'm rather pessimistic about how we're going to get there. So you have to be able to hold those two things in your head at the same time. But I'm sufficiently optimistic that I think writing a book like this and giving talks like this can get more people excited about a different type of future and a different way of getting there, so that maybe the transition won't be quite as bad as the current trajectory we're on. I mean, that's the whole point of this.
Okay, there's a question back there, and then a question up here. There's another microphone for... Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. This is Bhavna from Columbia Business School. It's nice to be on the campus of NYU to hear this, and it was an amazing talk.
This is really where the education happens. glad you're seeing the light.
Really?
Yeah.
It's nice to see you, Professor. It's nice to see you as well, Mr. Albert. One thing you mentioned earlier when we broke into the question answer round was that, you don't necessarily believe in consciousness, but of course, human beings are basically intelligence, and then knowledge is a true fact. That's one thing that kind of brings me to this question, that when we talk about AI, the same knowledge base, which now is basically internet for most of these AI-based, entrepreneurs, or for most of these innovations. And one fear I have is, what is going to keep that in check, that this knowledge is clean, fair knowledge going forward, that the AI or the intelligence that's coming along is going to be fair, just. And you also mentioned that you have certain ideas on, how to kind of mitigate the detrimental effects of AI going forward on the civilization. And I would like for you to elaborate on that.
I think there's really two classes of problems, right? There are what I think of as structural problems. So structural problems are things like biased algorithms. And we see biased algorithms everywhere. Like if you take a look at the YouTube algorithm makes things that are already popular even more popular, right? So that gives you this power law distribution of views on YouTube. Because of the training data we use, and also because of some of the objective functions of certain algorithms, they will be biased. And that's a problem, it's a worthy problem, and I'm not at all trying to diminish it. But it is in a different category than the existential risk. So the people who worry about existential risk are like, the AI is going to go off and do something really stupid that will be very detrimental to us as humans. And I believe that fundamentally we need to come up with different ways of training these models if we want to have a chance of having what people call an aligned AI, right? And the alignment problem is basically we would like an AI that is on team human at the end of the day, right? As opposed to on team AI and doesn't care about humans. And this alignment problem is difficult because we want what's called inner alignment. That is, we don't just want to be able to talk to the AI and the AI says, yeah, of course I'm here to help you. Right? We want an AI that deeply internalizes this idea that it is part of team human. The way we're doing it today is definitely not going to get us there. So today, these large language models are trained on the entire corpus of the internet. And then at the very end, we have some human feedback reinforcement learning added to it, right? And that's the rough equivalent of letting somebody grow up to be 18 years old and then say, let's sit down for 5 minutes and talk about, morals, right? Like, that's also not going to work. So that's, however, how we're currently training AI. So there's a project that some people are working on to basically come up with kind of more of a humanist corpus of knowledge that we could use to train AIs to deeply embed values in the AIs right along the way, not as an afterthought. And that's in a project that's in its infancy, but one I'm very excited about. And I believe that that kind of approach has the potential of, if we're going to get to superintelligence, which is still not known, but if we're going to get there, that kind of approach has the potential of coming up with a superintelligence that's actually deeply aligned with humanity.
Okay, we have a question here, and then maybe time for one more, and then yeah.
One here, one there.
Very interesting talk. I'm Smita. I'm part of the Fubon Center FinTech Advisory Board. And just like you have been a VC investor, so my question is related to entrepreneurship. And so entrepreneurs are supposed to be pioneers in coming up with the new ways and innovative ideas to solve wicked problems. So do you see entrepreneurship as a mechanism to channel this attention? Because the other stakeholders, usually governments, regulators, policymakers, are lagging behind in diverting this attention to some of these issues? Or do you see the whole paradox of the entrepreneurship being so driven by pricing mechanism that they would not actually divert attention to some of these innovations?
Yeah, so I'm a huge believer that we need both. We need entrepreneurial activity in all forms, including social entrepreneurship. So people doing things locally in their community. Somebody saying, I'm going to take charge and rally a group of people to build a park is a type of entrepreneurship in my mind. It's somebody saying, I want to see change and I'm not going to wait and ask others. I am going to create the change that I want to see. But I also think we need government. I just think this is sort of a false dichotomy that is frequently created where some side is like, well, these entrepreneurs are just taking ideas that have been funded with public money and then turning them into billion-dollar companies, and the government should be doing everything. And I just think that's a terrible idea. And conversely, saying that the government shouldn't be doing things is a terrible idea. I just think we really need both, and it's kind of annoying that in the year 2023 that's still an actual discussion. So.
All right, and our final question.
And really, in today's, when you're encountering knowledge or any kind of information, it's based on relevance. If you're going on Google, YouTube, it shows what you're interested in, what you would like to see, or if it's going to be interesting to you to keep focused on that platform. So what I'm curious about is, especially as we go on after capital where it's sufficient, how do we align people together where in problems where the cost is immeasurable by today's metric, to have people understand the same risk or that unmeasurable cost that is coming at us when we're overwhelmed by relevant information that might not be relevant for others?
Right. Well, I mean, I wish it would show you relevant information. For the most part, it shows you information that it thinks will make them money, right, by either you sticking around on the site longer or clicking on something that's an ad. But I don't actually think that once we free up enough attention, I don't actually think we need to be all that worried about people wanting to work on different things, because there's lots of things to be worked on, right? So this is also one of the reasons why I don't really think government should be in the business of telling lots of people what to do. I actually think we should just be in the business of freeing up people to work on interesting things. So I actually think that lots of people would like to work on asteroid detection and deflection. It's kind of a really cool problem to be working on, but instead they're in some job and they can't get out of it, right? And so I think that, there's this crazy idea that forcing kids to learn math is going to give us more mathematicians. It's like got to be one of the stupider ideas around. We should expose kids to math, and some kids are going to like math, and they're going to go, and we should let them go as far as they want to go with that. And then everybody else can get by with probably percentage calculation, So I guess I'm not really worried that if we free up attention that people aren't going to find the big problems interesting. I think people are fundamentally curious and they're going to find the big problems interesting.
Okay, well, that's sort of an optimistic note to end on.
Ooh, thank God.
Yes.